Let me call the guests to come to the rostrum. Khaled Suleiman. Khaled Suleiman. You are Iraqi. You are a Kurd. You live in Montreal, and you've been active since 2010. You publish articles in Arabic and in Kurdish in a number of media channels. Tessia Banlissa is Tunisian, who deals with environmental topics for Nawet. That's an online publication. We also have Guinea. We also have chairman of the Association of Journalists, Scientific Journalists of Guinea, Mr. Barry. And then Ida Nongyong, Senegalese, a climatologist and co-author of the 6th report of the of the International Panel on Climate Change. Perhaps you could put yourself there, and I'll set myself up here. Is that all right? I think that's all good. So please take your microphone. Anyway, the heat is on. The climate change is on the up. According to the Atmospheric and Oceanic American Association, we've had a world record for 4 consecutive days in the prevailing heat. China, the east of the country, is seeing the worst heat wave in its history. Mexico, Middle East, we're seeing temperatures beyond 46. And the world record was even beat this week, 51 degrees in the Death Valley. But it's even worse in other areas. And this heat, this extreme heat, talks about the mega fires in Tunisia, Canada, 8 million meters squared, went up in smoke. 9.3 is 9.3 million kilometers squared. I shouldn't really go too fast either. That would be much better. I'll try and do my best to slow down. So in Austria, we're talking about the surface area of Austria. That's 9.3 million kilometers. Burned forests in Canada for a number of months. Surface temperatures up elsewhere. The ice cap is melting. Anyway, we can see the effects, the palpable effects of climate change. So the question which is begged is this: how can we, at our level, as media players, how can we do our utmost to inform people? Now, the International Panel on Climate Change recalls that everything needs to be done at all levels by everybody. So we're very much involved at our level to do things. And you'll see that people left and right of me are doing their best endeavors. And if you're in this auditorium or if you're following remotely, no doubt this is a topic of interest to you. And just like all of us, we're asking ourselves searching questions. I'm a journalist at RFI, and I am responsible for an environmental program that's been around for 14 years on those airwaves. Now, Suleiman, for those who know you more, you're Kurd, you're Iraqi, you live in Montreal. I don't know what jet lag has done to you, but you look as though you're still in fine fettle. But anyway, since 2010, you've been an environmental journalist. You publish pretty much exclusively in Arabic and in Kurdish. But in what media? Before being an environmental journalist, I was a broad-based journalist. I wrote on politics, culture, and what have you. But since 2010, I've become an environmental journalist. As you said, I write in Arabic and in Kurdish. In Arabic, I write for Darech. It's based in Beirut. Because in the Arab world, they don't necessarily accept investigation or opinion-based articles on climate change or environmental damage. And in Kurdish, I publish in some media platforms in Kurdish language. But I bring out my articles specifically over the social networks.
Because I feel that articles, particularly very short articles, are read very quickly and people are extremely reactive. There are lots of comments. So that's a good way of getting a message across to the general public. Now, Tissia Ben Nasser, in Tunisia, you're in charge of climatic issues also on Alinea Buena. Yes, I'm a journalist for Nawat, which means a core or a kernel in Arabic. So it's a blog initially that was created by the political opposition and gradually turned into a professional system right after the revolution. So that was in 2011. There was a group of journalists that joined the team, the initial team, and that's how we're going on. I started at Anawet, writing on articles that provided solutions. I wrote on all sorts of different subjects, but it was always from this point of view, solution finding. And then about 6 years ago, I think, I started writing on just environment. Are you the only one then? Yes. Alpha Omar Bagoubari, president of the Association of Scientific Journalists and also Media Online's director. You set it up by these journalists. Tell us more about it. Well, I'm a trained journalist, and I started with Studio Hirondelle in Guinea. And this was founded by the foundation in Conakry, which was called Hirondelle. And after that, it shut down. But prior to that, I trained with the World Federation on Scientific Journalism on scientific articles, so press information. With our Guinean colleagues, we set up this Association of Scientific Journalists of Guinea. And after some time, we decided that we wouldn't be just an NGO, but we also had a sort of university.com, and which deals with scientific issues, not just environmental. We talk of health, agriculture, new technologies, IT, etc., and naturally environment as health, and it's this one health, yeah. Human health, animal health, environmental health, it's one health. And so this is a YouTube channel, and we are also present on the various media, Twitter, YouTube, etc., and of course on our own website. And I've been their publishing manager. Right, he's advertised himself. Jian Yongyong has written her 6th report on the IPCC, for the IPCC. And in group number 3, she looked at the way climate change is mediatized. Now, the good news is there are an increasing number of articles on the subject. Yes. Yes, I might remind you that we're going through a very critical period where the effects of climate change are now making themselves felt in different ways all over the world. It's again a very critical period today because we must undertake measures for future changes to limit future climatic risks. So against this background, journalists and media have a very important role to play. In fact, they can model the narrative on climate change and solution finding. Now, the IPCC looked at the power of, if I might say so, of journalism and came to the following conclusion: that there are more reports and stories on climate change very accurately and very specifically, but occasionally there's other information also which is not scientifically checked or curated and which is provided by groups. and which may actually delay the impact of climate change. So in that context, of course, media responsibility is very great. Give us the figures. Well, we've gone over 59 countries in different parts of the world. We've gone from 47,000 articles between 2016 and 17 to 87,000. It's more than doubled in 2019-20. So you're saying that the role of media is extremely important to be a transmission belt for all that is really produced by the media for people who don't know about it, and that all that they're suffering on a daily basis is actually due to climate change. That's right. It's important for media to talk about societal problems in this context of climate change. You don't do that very often. Very recently in Senegal, there were problems between fishermen's communities. In fact, there was unheard of violence between the two communities. We know that the sea resources now, marine resources, are now running short, perhaps bad management and pollution, and also the impact of climate change. So I spoke to a journalist who knew about it and asked him to discuss this point with me. But there was more political information than other. Khaled Suleiman, why is it so important for you to talk about all these subjects, if you could tell us briefly? Because environment, the ecosystem, the natural system is related to our life. It's intermingled with our existence. Biodiversity, jungles and forests and water. We cannot live without all this. It's our source of food and our source of water. Imagine if insects disappeared. 60% or 70% of them produce our food stock. So they play a very essential role on Earth. I come from a country that's been devastated by war, continuous war, internal war and regional war, etc. in Iraq. And now we are facing a major challenge. It's a threat. We have lost virtually 50% of our earth, if you like, of our the land, if you like, cultivable land, and which has a lot of biodiversity. So if there's no life in this earth, in this soil, then yes, it's lifeless. And that's a very essential point. Biodiversity, insects that we see in the soil, in the earth, make up 25% of biodiversity on Earth. In a few years, in a country like Iraq, demographic growth is leaping forward. It's really increasing. There are 43 million people in Iraq today. That's the population. In 10 years, or maybe 20 years, how are we going to live? How will we survive? Where will our food come from? The source of our very existence. And that's why I've started writing and speaking about the subject in public life. So, Ms. Nasser, in Tunisia also, there's also a lot of impact of environmental change, and you've had terrible droughts which have had a very huge impact on your harvest, on your crops. Is that the reason why it's so important to talk of these subjects, because of the changes? Yes, yes. It's important to talk about it because it's become a reality now on a daily basis. There's climate change, be it drought or hydric stress, or in farming and agriculture. There are several big problems. So when I go to write my story or cover a certain story, I talk on a given subject, but there are several others which are correlated. So it's really terrible to see how much environmental change is impacting all sorts of different segments of our population. We as journalists, we have a role to play. Obviously, we have to talk about what's happening, but not just relate facts. We also have to explain why all this has happened and determine responsibility. Why has this happened? Is this just natural phenomena, or is it the result of a deliberate policy? And we are demanding an answer. That's the role of us journalists. And environment is finally a secondary issue in Tunisia. It's very surprising because on a daily basis the population is suffering from this change, but somehow it doesn't seem to interest the powers that be. I feel, and a lot of other journalists are on my side, that we should connect environmental questions as well as to economic issues, political issues. There is a link so that environment enters all conversation. Yes, it's true, that is a reality. Any deterioration of the environment weakens everything and all the way we function. Alpha Omar Paris, in Guinea, the impact of environmental change, what is it that motivates you to talk about these subjects in Guinea? Well, for me, it's very simple because our existence depends on it. Our very existence on Earth depends on it. Of course, there are certain communities in Guinea, for instance. We have a long coastal line, but the people live under pressure on a daily basis. They're living with nature. Maybe they don't know, maybe they're not aware that there is a reason for these changes. As my colleague over here said, a lot of people feel that, well, it had to happen, and so they're fatalistic about it. It has to happen, it's destiny and all the rest of it. Whereas their own activity is likely to accelerate this change for the worse. So there's a real threat. And that's why within our organization, we are giving particular importance to climate change. In fact, we even applied when CFI talked about Terra Africa project, and our media was selected with other Guinean and South African region media for a training module on environmental change. Now, Idea Nyong'yong, concerning training, is there an issue with training journalists because people don't talk much about it? Is it because they don't know about it, they're uninformed? May I just react to what was just said? The earlier panel was talking to us about climate injustice. Those who emit the least, be it countries or countries, they suffer most due to climate change because of their vulnerability. And here again we can talk of injustice because it's the same population which is those who've got the least information who suffer most. Now, to come back to your question directly, training of journalists. Well, as far as I'm concerned, there are requests for training. So I have been involved in training modules for journalists within Terra Africa, but this was on conclusions of the IPCC reports. I think training should now be done over a long-term period for a better understanding of this concept and of the language used. Because when you talk to journalists, you find that a lot of effort has to be made. Something has to be done. Plus, importantly, it's the uncertainties and it's in scientific narrative that exists. So we must really, in order to try and justify the fact-based results. So the general public is not used to that. Now, IPCC realized that, and they've made an effort to find some sort of relevance between the different reports and the different cycles and the different working groups by setting up a standardized language. And they also assessed the understanding of the general public to this sort of standardized language. But despite all that, there are misunderstandings. Yes, there's a lot of confusion between meteorological conditions and climate. So there's a scale problem. You you talk about planetary issues over a period of time, which is, in 10, 20, 100 years. It's difficult to absorb. Huh? You're right. Yes, here too. On the very first day, I met two journalists and I talked about climate forecast, and their understanding was a weather forecast limited to 2 or 3 days. But these are important concepts that you must understand when you talk about climate change. Between weather forecast and climate predictions over 2 months and more, and other such climate changes based on greenhouse gas emission. So the timescale is important because you can provide news and information and say, perhaps there'll be abrupt changes. But journalists might understand it by saying sudden changes that will take place immediately, but when actually it's going to happen in 100 years. What's new in the sixth report of the IPCC is to talk now of long-term and short-term, long-term changes. Between now and 2030, between now and 2050, or especially with the limits on the 1.5-degree increased temperature change. All right, let's then just talk about the problems that you all face, the difficulty you have when you're exercising your profession. Khaled, you had said that there's a major issue, and it's the lack of data. You don't have enough information to find proof for what's happening in the field. Yes, yes, that's a major challenge, particularly in a country like Iraq or other countries in the Middle East or North Africa. It is a problem. We face it on a daily basis. There's nothing we can do about it. There's just no data, particularly in Iraq. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, there was a report, a scientific report that was published in a scientific review. And the research was on how in the last 40 years we've lost 1 million species, living species on Earth. I said to myself, this is huge. So I went into my own research. The article was written by several journalists, but there was one person who collated everything, the main author. So I sent him a message and I asked him, he's based in Australia. I asked him, in the Middle East, is it included in the report? And he said, no, unfortunately, it hasn't been included. Then how can you say that this is widespread on the planet when you leave out a whole region? That's a huge issue. You can't really believe everything that you read, and not even scientific research. You have to do your fact-checking. So I had to write an article. I felt it was a must to warn all these academics and research centers and so on and so forth in Iraq about this. But there was nothing about loss of biodiversity, of species lost in Iraq. That's a problem. Yes, of course, it's complicated. There's also the language problem, because you said you wrote to someone in Australia. You're speaking in French, but you must have written in English. Yes. You speak Kurd and Arabic, so that's a big issue because most of the scientific reports are in English. No, excuse me. Let me just finish what I was saying. Now, the IPCC report. These are my major sources of information, but for each of them, I have to find an incident, a story that's based in the field. There has to be some link between the report and actual facts and reality, because otherwise it's just hypothetical and it's too theoretical and people don't understand it. It's too abstract. So that's the way I proceed, and that's how I make understanding simpler. Tessir, I think concerning data, that's where journalists play an important role in the way they use data, because we're the ones who make data available for a large number of people. If you don't have data, you can't do much. there's there's superficiality in the articles. As a journalist, I find initially I did have access to quite a few curated data and reports. In fact, we did a lot of that in Nawel. We had a lot of pictures and images and graphics which were which spoke for themselves. So if you don't feel like reading the entire article, you just look at the pictures and understand what it's all about.
La problématique.
So today, without data, I feel a bit bare, a bit at a loss. And I mean, I primarily talk about what's going on the ground, but I'd like to give greater depth with the insight from scientists, with a scientist who's got figures to give me, facts and figures. In Tunisia, is there enough research units? Who are your interlocutors, in fact? Well, they do exist, but the problem is we don't have much contact with them. When it does exist, you immediately see the difference. I understand immediately much better, and so I can get that across much better in my articles. So I realize how important it is, that interaction. But it's rarer and rarer. And when you want to have information from the ministries, it becomes extremely difficult. So today, the only reports overlapping speakers are linked to the political situation such as it stands, the prevailing political situation. But the only reports I can reach are reports done by international NGOs or governmental representatives like the French Development Agency or the GZ or what have you. So that really helps us to have scientific input and insight in our articles. What about Guinea? Well, there are similarities. Some reports are published. So, I mean, looking at the IPCC's latest report, but locally, we have to. Well, we see the difficulty in having local experts to interpret, to understand the international reports and see how they relate to our local reality, looking at air quality. That's a concrete example in my area where there's a factory, the leading mining export facility in Africa, but it's an old facility. So there's air pollution that goes into the water. It's been seen by everybody. Our team went on site to produce a magazine article on this a few months back. But the local authorities and the experts that we wanted to meet locally and at Conakry, I can tell you, there was no report available on the air quality in the vicinity when everybody knows there's pollution. The local inhabitants are starting to cough. There are eyewitnesses. People are ill in the hospital. It has been confirmed. Patients are suffering from afflictions because of the quality of the air. But there's no hard and fast data, and so to say that this constitutes a danger for the local people, even though it's obvious and it's visible. Now, there has been the leaks from the factory because the facility is old. Those leaks go into the rivers. People are fishing in those rivers, but there's no hands-on report to say, right, the water quality in that river is not conducive for human consumption. But, people are drinking that water. People are catching illnesses because they're using water from that river. And there are wells dug. If the well isn't dug deeply enough, then the water that they can tap into is not fit for human consumption. But there's no report to help journalists to better grapple with these issues and offer solutions to these local communities. That's a genuine problem, isn't it? Access to data. It could be a linguistic barrier as well. I mean, I know when there's an IPCC panel report that comes out, I go to the press officer in my organization. Everything, all these interactions are done in English. If you don't speak English, then that can be a huge impediment, a huge stumbling block. And then you need to understand what's going on. Difficult language to really understand what's going on, access the data. Now, as a scientist, what do you say amongst yourself to enable Southern Hemisphere media to understand the language and to translate it into a language they can understand? Yes, you want to be able to translate quickly the synopses, the summaries that are intended for public decision makers in all the languages of the UN. That's what we think about. But the initial report comes out in English. But there's another problem. Journalists, in order to speak with the local people, they have to transcribe those reports. They will appear in French, but they have to transpose those concepts into the local language, and they find it difficult doing that transposition. Now, the data problem, the data deficit also hits the climate change matter. In our latest report, because of lack of data, we couldn't evaluate the trend for surrounding rainfall, whereas everybody on the continent is saying that strong rainfall is on the increase, but we don't have any data. In Central Africa, for example, there's data that we're lacking talking about rising temperatures. Rising temperatures are seen across the board, but there's no data. Attribution studies. In the Kivus, for example, there's an attribution science, it's called. So when there's extreme phenomena, scientists are now working in a short lapse of time to try and establish what's the role of climate change in these extreme phenomena. There have been floods in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda in March last. So there's been a number of international journalists who were deployed to try and understand what responsibility lies with climate change. But the results are very disappointing. The findings are very disappointing. That's right. One of the consequences of climate change is the increase in extremes. And so when there is a phenomena, then we do this attribution approach to see what's the role of climate change in that. But to do that, you need to have historical data. But if you don't have data, then you can't do the appraisal. But the attribution studies, that could be done on the deadly Nigeria floods that occurred last year. Now, the objective of this roundtable, and we've covered a certain number of problems, the idea is to do, how can we improve upon things? So perhaps I can ask each of you to respond to that. In Tunisia, you're saying, in order to catch people's interest and build a link between what they're living on a daily basis and link that with climate change, you want to tell stories. So what does that mean? It means you're going to go on the ground, you're going to try and link your scientific knowledge with what you can see happening on the ground? Yes, that's right. Well, I work and interact with civil society, really. It helps me understanding what's going on the ground and gives information to me. And they have deep-seated knowledge of what's going on locally with certain items of data that I don't have. So the civil society will pipe information through to me. Then I will do my job as a journalist. I will investigate. And then I go on the ground and I will do my report. And by hearing from people who have been impacted directly, well, necessarily, by getting across their stories, not only it reaches people's hearts and minds, and people realize, therefore, that the problems they're struggling with is problems struggled with by other people. And that's our job as a journalist, to raise awareness. So it's not just one isolated instance of a problem. No, it's a problem which is cross-cutting, particularly in Tunisia and nationwide. I mean, this year we had droughts that customarily afflicted the south, and now they're affecting the north. So this is entirely new. It's important to point this out. So it's telling stories, yes, but it's also offering a fresh story, because the climate issues is to challenge developmental or growth modes we've used thus far. So in each report, I try to challenge my readers by saying, look, why are we here? And I try really, and the people I'm interviewing as well, I mean, I try to go as far as I can with the people I interview so that we don't stay only with offering a testimonial, bearing witness and giving facts. All right, give us a tangible example. You're talking about cattle breeding, for example. That's really being destroyed because of climate change. People are moving on to different fields of work. That's right, we've got lots of farmers and animal breeders in Tunisia. They haven't disappeared. Contrary to Europe, we've gone from farming to large-scale farming but in Europe. But we have now small farmers, still small farm holdings, but that's disappearing as we speak, particularly because of droughts. So I went to an area in the north of Tunisia. It shouldn't really be affected by these things, but this year they were. And I was able to see farmers who were selling all their cattle and change jobs and sell their land as well. So, you know, this is what's happening now, and it's a tragedy. And so you're documenting that, you're tracking that. You know, we're all going to die. You know, we said that we're going to try to, you know, mobilize every effort in our body to avoid that. But, you know, reassure me, the IPCC panelists say that we can still react. Yes, we can, but the window is narrow. So this 10-year period is crucial, because if we don't do it now, well, because basically emissions needs to start falling, and they need to fall by half to make sure that we have 5 degrees between now and the end of the century. You know that with 1.5 degrees now, some risks will be on the up. So how do you go about doing things then? How to translate the IPCC reports and get across this idea that we're all going to die otherwise? Well, to translate the scientific reports into some sort of narrative which is straightforward and easy to understand for the reading or watching public, it's not an easy task. And this is why, I mean, earlier on I said that whenever I read a scientific report, I have to find a story. I have to get a link between our bread and butter reality and what's going on. So what did you do recently? Can you give us an example? Well, once again, I mean, I'm a journalist, aren't I? I'm always interested in a story. Once I read a very important report about the role of foodstuffs in forests. How do forests feed animals? So I talked about squirrels in forests. And what did I do? In Kurdish, we have a child's song. Men, women, children, when they were small or smaller, always remember this kind of nursery song. And it talks about squirrels. Sorry, you're talking about squirrels.
L'écureuil. Pardon, j'ai mal.
The moderator says the interpreter understood priests, but there's a problem of pronunciation with the gentleman talking about curé, which means priest, and écureuil, which means squirrel. Maybe I didn't pronounce squirrel properly. No, it's clearer now. It's me, I didn't understand well, says the moderator. Squirrel. Yes, I was talking about squirrels and not priests. So, this little animal, squirrels, in the forest. All right, let me get back to the squirrel. And as I said, there's this nursery rhyme in our Kurdish culture that talks about that. And that article really raised more interest than any other article I've ever written. And it was the chief editor who said, no, it's the most read article you've ever done. Because we need to raise awareness among people, make them remember how humans are very much linked intimately with animals. And this is a crucial point. We often make much of how to humanize things. and make scientific reports easier to understand. We often talk about ourselves, but I think we also need to animalize things, if I can put it that way. Thinking about academic reports, make it more understandable, because the relationships between animals and humans, this goes back to the roots, the beginnings, the origins of the Earth and life on Earth. That's how that's my approach. It's the living world, as it were. All right, Alpha, what about you? How do you go about doing things in your media outlet to try and get across this this idea of holding appeal for people? Because they don't necessarily want to read this information about the environment. It's rarely good news. Well, we try and go to that community that was mentioned earlier on. We don't want to only confine ourselves to scientific reports or institutional reports or politicians. We want to hear from local communities. What do you know about climate change? Because often people think that if there's a rise in water levels in their vicinity, they'll think it's natural and that's just part of the natural process. But in the coastal regions, for example, they're starting to introduce salt into rainwater, and the mangroves are getting damaged. So we want to hear from local people. What is their daily reality? And many people they don't realize that their daily activity can deteriorate or damage the environment and contribute to climate change. So basically, we're trying to understand or trying to get resource people. And then Guinean researchers, of course, have worked on the fact that, well, there's mining in Guinea, so this produces red sludge, which finds its way into the natural world and means that cultivable land is encroached upon. And researchers did a study on red sludge. And Guinea is the biggest producer of rice as well, and red sludge with rice can be used to bake bricks that resist better than cement bricks. Now, this is a solution that could potentially be of interest in areas where we see mining activity. So that red sludge can be used in conjunction with the rice in order to produce bricks that could then be less expensive and actually are more robust than cement breeze blocks. So if you look at these studies' findings, and you look in these areas where we have where we can collate knowledge as well, and we can use that knowledge in conjunction with the scientific knowledge, in the case in point being this study on the red sludge and the rice. But the politicians, there's like divergent language, and they say, we've done this, that, and the other, and we're going to do this. But really, it's really the NGOs and the not-for-profits on the ground that are doing the on-the-ground work, but the state is just confines itself with making empty rhetoric, because when you go to the ground, you realize that that political language hasn't found its way onto the ground. So, we want to get to the people who are primarily the people ultimately hit. Well, it's difficult talking about climate urgency without falling into the trap of dramatizing and over-dramatizing things. Because, look, we work with press officers, press experts, basically to try and get across an accurate picture of things, to avoid saying that there's nothing more that can be done, throw in the towel. An example, rising ocean levels. Irrespective of the emission scenario that we'll be using, seawater levels are going to rise. But my positive spin on this is, based on the emissions scenario, the pace at which water levels are going to rise differ. For example, with a low emission scenario, between now and the end of the century, we're not going to go beyond 50 centimeters compared to 1900 water levels, seawater levels. But a scenario at a high emission level, well, we're beyond a meter. So that's a positive message, isn't it, really? Because it gives us more time to implement adaptive measures. But it's not easy, I acknowledge that. But as a scientist, I know that things are going to get nasty, possibly. We need to offer solutions. Because I work with my colleagues to talk about the effects of climate change on physical phenomena. But Group 2 and Group 3 talk about solutions, to adaptation solutions, about mediation, attenuation. We also know for decarbonizing energy, we know that the price for renewables is down. It's lost 85% in the space of 10 years. The price has dipped. And what we're lacking is the courage, is the bravery to take on inertia, particularly among the political classes.
So now you've got 5 minutes to ask questions, to participate in this talk. Now there's a team in the University of Lausanne who's launched 50 different questionnaires, etc. And there are plenty of other articles that are called Nature and Science. So the way this research was covered by media, essentially European and North American, but of course it has representations in other parts of Southern media. So now one of the conclusions was that our brain is not designed to adjust to remote threats, be it in a time point of view or geographical point of view. So your right solution is to tell stories, give incidents of what's happening around you to the local population. But then what should we do next to turn it into action? Because you can document a catastrophe, but then how do you make people work, get up and take action, move it? Of course, it's not just up to the media, but it's for us also to mobilize people after providing information. What do you do to make sure it triggers something off? Tessir. It's very difficult to measure the impact of my work, of our work. Okay, you might publish a video or an article, and then you see if it's got any popularity, interaction, etc. on the social media. How many likes and so much, so on, the smileys, but it doesn't go further than that. But in my solution-based journalism course, I realized that what I could do was provide lasting solutions which can be repeated elsewhere. And talking about the way it was done, the methodology that was used and that was applied by all these initiatives, I noted that other initiatives were actually reproduced. For example, very quickly, I wrote an article on public water tanks that were renewed in Djerba. Djerba is an island to the south of Tunisia, and for several years now, they've had a water problem. So very often there's water supply is cut off. So there were citizens' associations said that we've got these water tanks. There are more than 200 on the island of Djerba. Let's go renovate them, and that will help us to store water. And so there'll be water accessible for several villages, thirsty villages. So one water tank, they did 15 out of the 20 which were being renovated. So that's work in progress. So in one of the villages, I found that water tank that was renewed gave 2,500 people had access to drinking water. These are very simple solutions. They don't cost much to renovate all these tanks. You've got them all over. But since you've got running water, no one bothers about them. So now associations found my article, got in touch with me, or got in touch with the association in question and said, hey, look, we can do it, let's do it, and let's do it on our island. So, of course, it's, every drop makes an ocean, these are small steps that we're taking. So sometimes, there is some resonance. Well, and when COVID-19 was spreading all over, I wrote an article. It was called that climate change is more dangerous than COVID. That was my headline, and there were serious discussions when I wrote that. And a lot of people And a lot of colleagues said that I was exaggerating and that climate change was not more dangerous than COVID-19. Because this epidemic was just there at your door. It had come in. So it was very close to us, this threat. It was in our lives. But now COVID-19 is over. We've gone over it. It's behind us. But climate change is still there. It hasn't disappeared. And that's exactly what you said. I asked young people this question, young people I meet on a daily basis. I asked, do you talk about climate change? And one of the young people gave me this answer. I've got a lot to talk about. I've got a lot to do in my daily life. I don't have time for this climate change, and it's a very remote threat. I'll live another 50 or 60 years or 80 years. So that's enough. That's enough for me. It's a long time span. They don't realize that on a daily basis it's an issue. That's why I was saying you really have to make people aware, increase awareness. Oh, it's that squirrel, the famous squirrel that was sanctified. May I have a copy, please? Let me finish my sentence. I think you've got to make people aware once again and more committed to this problem of the natural system that is suffering, of biodiversity and everything. Alpha. Personally, it's very difficult to measure the impact of all that we are doing, to understand what the effect is. You might talk to the audience and so on. This person is talking to you. And he or she can't say, no, I don't understand what you're saying. And they're going to say, yes, of course, we appreciate what you're doing. Yeah, but with Universe Science, you also make translations that you broadcast in the local languages, 35 different languages. So you're talking to communities, really to them. So within these communities, linguistic communities, the ones you were talking about, do you see any changes in understanding and, in behavior? Well, a magazine that's read by rural areas, rural radio stations, is on health. That's the one that most people read. But the aim behind Universe Science is, since we have a more positive aim behind it, since people are reading this magazine and it has an impact on them, let's do the same thing with climate change. Because the advantage with all these local radios and these rural areas radios is that they are in every village, and on each radio station it's broadcasted according to the local languages. So in Universe Science, we are writing mini magazines now, or broadcasting mini magazines in French and in the main languages of Guinea. So if it's broadcast on our internet site, for someone who doesn't speak French, let's say he speaks in Susu or Manita, and he can listen to the report in his own language. Questions? Questions? Yeah, sorry, Aida. Well, climate action, particularly in Africa. It's very limited. It's, here and there, and it's the communities that really suffer when we talk about adjusting to climate change and who take measures. But I think action will only take place if citizens get up and ask for it, because politicians are only looking at a short-term victory, and that is electoral terms. So to get citizens to understand, you must write articles. They must understand that food insecurity, certain health problems are all related to climate change. I was talking to a Senegalese lady. We were preparing for elections, but there you go, we were talking about it together. But when politicians are invited, no one asks them about their environmental policy. It doesn't interest them, especially, climate change. Any questions? Comments? We have a quarter of an hour. I can see hands going up. Thank you very much. My name is Roland Daziaka. I also spoke on this subject, so my question today is, now today with this climate crisis and all the fake news that's going around on climate, because there's intox also, there's defox also, these on the subject. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with all the fake news and the wrong sources? Secondly, we see that climate is just one of the trees that hide the forest, you know. And as environmental journalists, how do you set up links between climate change, population, and biodiversity? Thank you. I don't mind starting. I can answer your first question, and that's about disinformation. Just for you to let you know, there's not just disinformation, there are also scientific theories which are encouraging people to work on some certain solutions which are completely fake. In the USA, for instance, and in Australia and even in Europe, there's a special subsidy. For instance, this theory of injecting aerosols or sprays, this goes against nature, against the system itself, the natural system, against everything, because cooling climate, the atmosphere, is not something artificial. And now Western governments are working on a very dangerous subject. You mean all this bioengineering with bad solutions. But I think it was more than solutions that the lady was asking. It was about disinformation. Just to comment on that, there's less and less of people skeptical about climate change, at least I hope so. I know that in my program, I know that science is not an opinion. So you have to take the help of people who have a serious degree in their subject, so people who are credible in the subject, and not just hand over the floor to any Tom, Dick, and Harry who says just anything. I think it's where the source of information comes from that lends credibility. Let me just finish, Madam Aida. As I was saying, it's not just about information, there's also theory. And these theories, these are dangerous scientific theories that go against the natural system, and those should be, people should be warned about them. We, as environmental scientists and scientific journalists, we should have a good knowledge of all these fake theories. There you go. So as not to talk about anything in rubbish. I agree with Khalid. Because you know what's happening now? There's less information to fight climate change because it's so obvious. But these miracle solutions, for instance, not to decarbonate economy, you know, they talk about such things. Yes, they want to plant artificial trees now to get to zero carbon. That's crazy. That's madness. Yes? I have a question. Is there any positive impact of climate change? I'm asking because in Mali, we never exported as much wheat as we did, and we've produced a lot of wheat because it's raining a lot. So have you seen any, positive side effects? And what do you do with that? I hope this isn't fake news. And secondly, so this energy transition business, it's expensive. And governments are now finding it difficult to meet all their responsibilities. So how do you make governments aware of all this? All this seems rather remote. You as scientists, journalists, and so on. Aida. Yeah, of course, there are positive runoffs in some areas. You talked of Mali and wheat production. Yes, it's true. In Sahel and in Mali, we've got the African monsoon that determines rainfall, and there are two aspects which are, opposition concerning monsoon, the effect of sprays and greenhouse gases. Now, aerosols are pollution particles, and for a long time, the greenhouse effect was masked by the effect of all these sprays, not just on the continent in Africa, but in Europe and in America. So the sprays effect reduces rainfall in Sahel. Since the middle of the 1980s, there are rules now and regulations, so there are few sprays that are being used. So now we see the greenhouse gas effect and greenhouse effect. So that leads to increase of rain. But there's more variability from one year to the next. There's more fluctuation between the start of the monsoon and the end. You get extreme flooding, extreme raining. And as the temperature increases, there'll be more rain in most of Sahel, in the center and the east, but there'll be a drop in rainfall in western Sahel, including Mali, Mauritania, Senegal, and the coastal areas right up to the Gulf of Guinea. And then more rain on very dry earth or arid earth or soil. You must have tested this in your gardens and park. When it rains a lot on dry earth, it just runs off. It is not absorbed. It leads to flooding. In fact, all the floods that you see regularly, it's because the earth is not absorbing all this water. The runoff, it just runs off. There'll be greater drying during the drying season because the temperature shoots up and there's a lot of evaporation. So it's positive, but. Now, how about connecting the different items at stake? Khaled did mention it. Now, Ida has also talked about the link between pollution and greenhouse gases effect. It's true that with the massive disappearance of biodiversity and climate are very closely connected subjects. Look at the forests, for instance. You cut down the woods and you release carbon, whereas they tend to sequester carbon. So the greater the biodiversity and greater the preservation, the better we arm ourselves for climate change. And two scientific IPBES for biodiversity and IPCC are working together now to create links and have common working groups to come up with common solutions to fight both. I've got something to add. I think the best solution to protect nature, biodiversity, is to have natural reserves, or parks. That works very well. It's very efficient. There are workers who do that sort of thing. There's a means of reactivating local communities, in their own neighborhood, in their environment, to save nature. There you go. Yes, just to answer your question. Yes, it's true. Climate change has an impact on biodiversity, but just to come back to pollution, if you fight pollution, atmospheric pollution, and climate change, it has an eco-benefit on health. When you're fighting pollution measures, you will lose that cooling effect of aerosols or the spray, so there'll be an extra heating. But on the other hand, there will also be a reduction in methane emissions, so naturally that's better for your health, and you'll feel that immediately. And plus, in 20 years, you'll see there's a drop in temperature. There you go. I hope you got that. Yes? Can't hear the gentleman. Amaury Dongeron. I also work for the IIFI. I'm an analyst, journalist. How about climate migrants or immigrants? In your different countries, is this migration due to climate? Do you ever consider that? So is it just dealt with in just the general news or miscellaneous items? Or is there something specifically done about it? Well, just a few weeks ago, I talked about just this issue, climate immigrants. I went to Delfauer area, which is really at the the entry point of the desert, and there's normally no immigration because it's an oasis. So the local population lives around the oasis, lives off agriculture, and dates. They grow dates. It's just that for the last few years, because of dryness and drought, they couldn't depend on just rainfall, so they had to set up facilities which cost a lot of money. They had to bore holes, and since these plots are quite far from the cities, they had to set up solar panels to use these pumps. I think it was 50,000 dinars for each rig or each pump, 15,000 euros. So that represented a lot of money. So what happened was investors came in from the coast, or from Sfax and from the capital, who bought up all this land. So the local population sold their land, and they became workers on their own land, or they had to leave. They had to leave their own villages.
And that's what struck me quite a lot, because we're starting to see the initial waves of departure, whereas previously there was this tradition for migrating. But when you go on site, it was very difficult. How can I put it? Well, much is made of economic reasons. It's for economic reasons, they say. But fundamentally, when you scratch more than the surface, what you realize is, no, it's climate change. It's climate change which has put themselves in that situation where they have to sell their land. So, yeah, we'll try to look into this, but it's very recent, yeah? And I haven't read much material on this. About Tunisia, I mean. In Guinea, yes, there are climate displaced persons, but there's not enough articles, there's not enough content about this. A few months back, our team did go into one of the Guinea prefectures, into a village where over the last few years people have had to leave twice, but there's not enough content to talk about the situation of these communities that had to leave their homes, basically because water had flooded their area, and they had to abandon fishing, they had to abandon farming, and they had to go a dozen or so meters away. But still, even then, they had to leave because the water was spreading still. So some people decided to leave the village altogether to go off further into the bush, which means it's going to throw up additional problems for the prefecture, because when the new arrivals won't necessarily be able to do fishing or farming. And so in some way or another, they're probably going to leave the country and migrate because of the internal migration. Just the last word, because in Iraq, climate migration is underway as we speak. There are hundreds of families that have left their area, particularly in the southern areas of Iraq, in the marshlands. They had to leave because they've got no natural resources anymore because of droughts. So they come into the cities without work, without salary, without any accommodation to go to. All right, thanks very much. We've reached the end, unfortunately, of this sequence. We said it would be 5, but we've tipped over 5. Perhaps take a last question.
Alors, une dernière question. Allons-y.
A last question, then. The questions are really interesting. Here, there's a gentleman here. No, there's the microphone over there, I think. Oh, sorry. And then we'll extend the Q&A for anybody who wishes to carry on the discussion. We're here tomorrow. My name is Bikayab. I'm a Saishi employee. Here's a question. Well, first a comment before I turn to my question. Oil and gas were discovered pretty much everywhere in Africa, in Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal specifically. We know that oil and gas is a fabulous financial windfall for those countries. It can finance national education, finance the health system. All right, but here's my question, and it's for Ida. Now, let's imagine that tomorrow you're elected president of Senegal. The elections are coming, and you've got this kind of file that arrives on your desk. Economy or money?
Alors, c'est une question difficile.
It was a difficult question, particularly because it's highly unlikely I'll ever become president of the Republic. But nevertheless, I don't think you want to put all your eggs in one basket, because I can see in Senegal, it's not only use of oil, but also oil derivative companies, that their growth is being fostered. And we can now end up with stranded assets that have been devalued. Because if you put basically your entire economy, if you underpin it on oil and gas, a few years down the road, there won't be any more money. It will just dry up. And at the same time, well, what we should be doing is developing other industries based on renewable energy. Because we can see in a number of countries, it's not because there's this oil and gas windfall that people actually live better. Just let me add very swiftly one comment. If you're interested, there's a report done by Nicholas Stern, an economist, a report that was done for the latest COP27. You can get it on the internet. And the findings of the report show that investing in fossil-fueled infrastructure today, I mean, if you become president of the Republic, he might see, the dollar signs appear in his eyes, and he's going to have dollar after dollar. But after 20 years, when you decide to build a project, and when the project becomes operational, you have to wait for 20 years. So you have to think about that time frame, because 20 years down the road, really, will it be good for African countries to have invested in oil and gas-based infrastructures? All the economic findings show that given the impact and the mounting impact of climate change, it won't be profitable. So it's that message that needs to be got across, and not only simply to say that the Western world is brimming with oil and gas and growth, and we are not allowed to grow. But no, times have changed. It's no longer, I mean, over and beyond the fact that we don't want to exploit anybody, but it's not profitable even 10 or 15, 20 years down the road. All right, thanks very much to one and all. And well done.